You're visiting a wildlife sanctuary, eager to see some of the most incredible creatures on the planet. You're wandering from exhibit to exhibit, soaking in the beauty of the animals, when suddenly you stumble upon something that stops you dead in your tracks. A baby chimpanzee. But not just any chimpanzee. A young, vulnerable little one being treated harshly by a zookeeper. The zookeeper, oblivious to the eyes watching, is using the baby chimp to entertain the crowd, pushing it to perform for the tourists. The scene is uncomfortable, and you can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. But what if I told you that one of the people witnessing this disturbing display wasn't just a regular tourist? What if I told you that Shaquille O'Neal, yes, the Shaq, was right there, standing in that very crowd? How could something like this happen, and what does it mean for the animals and the people involved? In the world of wildlife sanctuaries and zoos, you often expect to see expert care and respect for the creatures. But sometimes, the reality behind the scenes can be more shocking than anyone could imagine. In this case, the zookeeper's actions were far from the compassionate treatment that should have been given to this innocent chimpanzee. But as the story unfolds, it turns out that what happened that day goes much deeper than just one poor animal being mistreated. There's a twist that will make you question the intentions of those in charge, and more importantly, what happens when people like Shaquille O'Neal, who is not just a celebrity but someone with a huge platform, become part of the story. Now picture this: Shaq in the middle of this interaction, watching in disbelief. While most tourists might have quietly observed, Shaquille O'Neal's presence changes everything. Not only is he an international sports icon, but he's also known for his larger-than-life personality and influence. His reaction to what was happening to the baby chimpanzee could have serious consequences, especially when the spotlight was on him. What would someone like Shaq do in the face of animal cruelty, especially when it's right in front of him? Would he speak out? Would he take action? Or would he just keep quiet and walk away? But the twist doesn't stop there. As you'll see, Shaquille O'Neal's involvement in this situation sets off a chain of events that nobody could have predicted. From a simple visit to a sanctuary to becoming part of a much bigger story, the actions and decisions made that day have lasting effects on both the zoo and the future of the baby chimpanzee involved. The zookeeper, unaware of who is observing, doesn't realize the gravity of the moment. But once it's too late, things spiral out of control, and the consequences are far-reaching, touching on everything from animal welfare to the power of celebrity influence. By now, you might be wondering, what exactly did Shaq do in this situation? What was his reaction? And more importantly, what happened to the baby chimpanzee, whose fate hung in the balance? Stay with me, because the answers are coming soon. But trust me, you won't believe the unexpected turn this story takes. So, as we dig deeper into this strange and unsettling event, think about what it means to be a bystander in a situation like this. How much influence does one person have, even if they're just a tourist visiting a zoo? What happens when the right person sees something they shouldn't, and what are the consequences for the people who have control over these animals? Could this moment have sparked a movement that could change how we view animal treatment in sanctuaries forever? Or was it just another story of a celebrity passing through, leaving a trail of headlines behind but no real change? This story is about more than just an unfortunate incident at a zoo. It's about the power of observation, the responsibility that comes with it, and how people, big or small, famous or unknown, can play a pivotal role in the fight for animal rights. But the true question remains: what happens next? How will the story unfold? And will justice prevail for the baby chimpanzee who was caught in the middle of it all? Stick around, because this tale is just beginning, and it will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about how animals should be treated in places meant to protect them. The story behind the baby chimpanzee begins long before that fateful day at the wildlife sanctuary. Like many zoos and animal parks around the world, this sanctuary had a reputation for caring for animals in need, rescuing them from harsh conditions, and giving them a second chance at life. But as with many places that rely on funding and public interest, there was pressure to keep the tourists engaged and entertained. Visitors came in droves, eager to see exotic animals, watch them perform, and take selfies with them. In some places, that meant blurring the lines between conservation and spectacle, between treating animals with respect and using them as a form of live entertainment. The baby chimpanzee was one such case. Rescued from a small, overcrowded facility, It had been through more trauma in its short life than most humans could imagine. Though still young and malnourished, it was healthy enough to be moved to the sanctuary, where the hope was to slowly rehabilitate it. Chimpanzees are incredibly intelligent animals, but they also require a great deal of care and attention. Their emotional and social needs are complex. The idea was that, in time, the chimpanzee would learn to socialize with others of its kind and eventually be integrated into the sanctuary's larger primate group. But unfortunately, the sanctuary's resources were limited. The staff was stretched thin, and the pressure to bring in tourists to support the operations was constant. The baby chimpanzee became a symbol of hope, but also a way to attract crowds. The zookeeper in charge that day was someone who had worked at the sanctuary for years, though it was clear from the start that not all of the staff had the same level of empathy toward the animals. Some were there simply for the paycheck, while others were genuinely passionate about animal welfare. The zookeeper, let's call him Greg, had grown complacent over the years. He knew the baby chimpanzee needed special care, but his attention was divided. When the sanctuary was busier than usual with tourists, Greg saw an opportunity to put the chimpanzee on display for a crowd, offering them a chance to watch the young chimp interact with humans. The moment would seem cute and engaging, perhaps too much so for anyone to see the harm it might cause. It was a common practice at many zoos and sanctuaries, especially in a highly competitive environment where attention was everything. But for the baby chimpanzee, it was a daily reminder that it was treated less as a sentient being and more as a showpiece, an object of amusement. Still, Greg didn't think much of it. He had done it before with other animals and hadn't seen any immediate fallout. To him, it was simply part of the job. He wasn't prepared for the day Shaquille O'Neal would walk through the gates. Shaq had never been to this particular sanctuary before. Like many celebrities, he loved animals, and he had long been an advocate for wildlife preservation. He had a soft spot for primates, too, having visited other sanctuaries in the past to support conservation efforts. That day, he was there on a spontaneous trip with a few friends, enjoying some downtime away from the spotlight. Shaq had always been known for his larger-than-life personality, but he was also someone who had an innate sense of justice. He was the type of person who didn't shy away from uncomfortable situations, and when something caught his attention, it was impossible to ignore. When Shaq and his friends made their way through the sanctuary, they were first greeted by the more common exhibits: the lions, the tigers, and the elephants. But when they wandered toward the primates section, something stopped him in his tracks. The baby chimpanzee was alone in its enclosure, and it wasn't just playing or eating. It was being pushed and prodded by Greg, the zookeeper, trying to get it to perform certain actions for the tourists. At first, Shaq thought he was seeing things. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. The baby chimpanzee was clearly distressed, nervously shifting from one side of the cage to the other, clearly uncomfortable. Yet Greg didn't seem to care. He just kept directing the chimpanzee to interact with the crowd. Shaq had always been a person to speak out when something wasn't right. But in that moment, standing in the crowd, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to step in immediately, confront the zookeeper, and demand better treatment for the baby chimpanzee. But another part of him wasn't sure what would happen if he did. Would he make a scene? Would he risk damaging the sanctuary's reputation or the livelihoods of the people working there? After all, this was just a small part of a much larger system. He wasn't sure if he had the power to do anything that would make a real difference. As he stood there, watching Greg treat the chimpanzee more like a performer than a living creature with its own rights, Shaq felt the weight of the moment. His large frame seemed to dwarf everything around him, but in that moment he felt small, caught between doing the right thing and staying silent. The tension was palpable. The chimpanzee was clearly struggling. Greg, oblivious to Shaq's presence, continued to push the animal further, trying to get it to act in front of the crowd. It was hard for Shaq to stomach, but the turning point came when one of the tourists in the crowd, a child no older than 8, called out to Greg, asking if the chimpanzee was okay. The question echoed through the group, and for a split second, everything seemed to stop. Shaq wasn't sure if it was the child's innocent inquiry or the mounting discomfort in the air, but in that instant, Greg's facade cracked. He paused, caught off guard. For the briefest moment, it seemed like he wasn't entirely sure how to respond. The child's question had put everything on the line, and Shaq could see that the zookeeper was beginning to realize that things weren't as simple as he thought. The tension was growing, and now, with the baby chimpanzee visibly distressed and the crowd starting to murmur in disapproval. It was clear that the situation was escalating. Would Greg double down, or would he back off? And would Shaq take that first step to speak up, or would he let the moment slip away? The silence hung in the air, and Shaq knew this wasn't just about the chimpanzee anymore. It was about something bigger, about what was right and wrong, and about the role people like him could play in changing the system. But before any decision could be made, something unexpected happened. A shout came from the back of the crowd, pulling everyone's attention away from the baby chimpanzee and toward the main entrance of the sanctuary. It was the sound of someone rushing in, but who? What would happen next? Would it be too late for the baby chimpanzee? And what would Shaq do now that the stakes had risen even higher? The tension was unbearable, and everything was about to change. But what would that change be? The shout from the back of the crowd sent a ripple of confusion through everyone standing near the chimpanzee's enclosure. The tourists turned, squinting to see who was causing the disturbance. Their attention suddenly diverted from the tense interaction between Greg and the young chimpanzee. Shaq, too, was momentarily distracted, his focus broken by the unexpected noise. A man in a suit was pushing through the crowd, his voice raised as he hurried toward the front of the sanctuary. It wasn't just anyone rushing in, it was the sanctuary's director, a man named Richard Hayes, whose reputation preceded him. Richard was a larger-than-life figure in the world of wildlife conservation, known for his charismatic speeches and high-profile endorsements. He had recently secured a large donation from a corporate sponsor, which had lifted the sanctuary out of financial trouble. But the director's reputation also came with its own baggage. Beneath the polished exterior, Richard had long been known for bending the rules when it suited him, especially when it came to managing the sanctuary's animals. Rumors had circulated that he was more concerned with keeping up appearances than ensuring the well-being of the creatures in his care. As Richard made his way through the crowd, Shaq couldn't help but feel a wave of unease wash over him. The way the director was striding forward, quickly, purposefully, was not lost on him. It was clear he had been alerted to the situation with the chimpanzee, and something about the way he held himself made Shaq suspect that Richard was about to intervene in some way, but not for the right reasons. Greg seemed to straighten up, his posture stiffening as the director arrived at the front of the enclosure. The zookeeper's expression shifted, from one of irritation to something more defensive, almost like he had been caught in the act. Richard addressed Greg with a clipped tone, his words hushed but urgent, as if trying to avoid drawing more attention to the unfolding drama. Shaq could hear fragments of their conversation. "You're pushing it too far, Greg," Richard said, his voice sharp. "The tourists are getting uncomfortable. We don't want another scandal on our hands, especially not with the press coming this weekend." Shaq watched closely, his gut tightening with suspicion. This wasn't about the well-being of the chimpanzee. It wasn't about its distress or its treatment. It was about keeping things quiet, about maintaining the illusion of a well-run sanctuary. Shaq knew enough about the world of entertainment to understand the game being played here. If something went wrong, the media would pick up on it, and the money would stop flowing. It was always about the image. Greg nodded quickly, clearly relieved that the director wasn't reprimanding him in front of the crowd. "I thought I could calm them down with a little performance. I know the tourists like seeing the chimpanzee interact with people." Richard glanced at the chimpanzee, his eyes scanning the creature's twitching body, its wide, fearful gaze locked onto the people around it. "No more performances for now. We'll deal with this later, but you're right to back off. We can't afford to lose face." Shaq's heart sank. It was clear that Richard wasn't concerned about the chimpanzee's distress, or the fact that it was being exploited for entertainment. He was worried about losing the crowds, about jeopardizing the donations and the funding that the sanctuary so desperately needed. It wasn't just a problem with one zookeeper, it was systemic. Richard wasn't a hero in this story, he was part of the problem. But Shaq wasn't the only one noticing the cracks in the sanctuary's facade. The tourists around him began to murmur quietly among themselves, some looking uncomfortable, others confused, as they witnessed the director and zookeeper's whispered conversation. The child who had asked about the chimpanzee's well-being was still standing nearby, her eyes wide with concern. Her mother, who had been oblivious to the situation moments before, now stood frozen, her face pale as she processed what was happening. The tension among the crowd was palpable, as if everyone was waiting for someone to say or do something. Shaq had heard stories about animal cruelty in places like this, but seeing it firsthand was something different. He was no stranger to tough situations, having faced his own share of public scrutiny and difficult decisions in his career. But this was different. He felt a responsibility, not just as a celebrity but as a person, to speak out. The baby chimpanzee's distress had not gone unnoticed by him, and he couldn't just stand there in silence, watching the situation spiral further out of control. But what could he do? He wasn't an expert in animal rights or sanctuary management. Could he really make a difference by speaking up? Was it even his place to interfere in something he knew so little about? The questions gnawed at him, and for a brief moment, he found himself paralyzed by doubt. Then something shifted. The young child, who had asked about the chimpanzee earlier, stepped forward from the crowd, her small voice carrying a quiet but resolute tone. "Is the chimpanzee okay?" she asked again, her eyes fixed on Richard, her innocence cutting through the tension. "Why is it so scared?" Shaq felt his heart tighten. The simplicity of the question was enough to expose the core of the problem. The chimpanzee wasn't okay. And that's when Shaq realized that it wasn't just up to him or the director to address it. It was up to everyone in that crowd. The problem was bigger than any one person. It was about the system, about the way zoos and sanctuaries were run, about how animals like this chimpanzee were treated not as individuals but as commodities. Richard's gaze flickered toward the child, and for a moment, Shaq thought he might say something meaningful. But instead, Richard offered a forced smile, crouching down to the child's level with practiced ease. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Don't worry. The chimpanzee's just a little tired. It's all part of the show." The crowd's discomfort grew. Shaq could see it in their faces. Many of them didn't buy Richard's story. Some shifted uneasily. Others shook their heads, and a few even took a step back. The pressure was mounting. The longer this played out, the more people were questioning whether this sanctuary was really the place they thought it was. But Richard wasn't about to let it unravel just yet. "We'll take good care of the chimpanzee," he added quickly, his tone still patronizing. "You can trust us." And with that, he motioned for Greg to back away from the enclosure, signaling that the performance was over, at least for now. But the damage had already been done. Shaq knew that this wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about everything that led to this moment. And it wasn't over. The question was, who would stand up for the baby chimpanzee now? Would anyone be brave enough to confront the truth of what was happening behind the scenes? The suspense hung in the air, thick and suffocating, leaving everyone wondering just how deep the rabbit hole went. The uneasy silence that followed Richard's dismissal of the situation was deafening. Tourists, still in shock from the awkward encounter, slowly began to move away from the chimpanzee's enclosure. But Shaq didn't budge. His mind was racing, and his eyes remained fixed on the baby chimpanzee. Every nerve in his body told him that this wasn't right, that this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding or an isolated mistake. The sanctuary wasn't just offering an entertainment show. It was exploiting an innocent creature in front of an entire crowd. And as much as he tried to push the thought away, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Richard and Greg were more concerned about saving face than actually addressing the deeper issues at play. Shaq's thoughts were interrupted by the child's voice again. She wasn't ready to let it go, and Shaq admired her courage. "Why is the chimpanzee still alone?" she asked, her voice small but full of conviction. "Where are the other chimps? Why doesn't it have anyone to play with?" The question hung in the air like a truth no one wanted to confront. It was clear that the sanctuary's claims of providing a safe, nurturing environment for animals were nothing more than a facade. Shaq could see that the other tourists were starting to notice, their whispers growing louder. They, too, were starting to question the sanctity of the place. And Shaq knew if they didn't act now, the situation could spiral even further. Richard stood up from his crouched position and shot Shaq a quick glance. For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Shaq could see the director's discomfort, his carefully constructed confidence cracking under the weight of the moment. Richard's facade was crumbling, and he didn't like it. But before either man could say anything, a shout came from the far end of the sanctuary. It was one of the sanctuary's employees, running toward them with a look of panic on her face. "There's a problem in the back," she exclaimed out of breath. "We've got a situation with the other primates." Shaq's heart skipped a beat. His instincts told him that whatever was happening with the other primates was far more urgent than anything that had just occurred at the enclosure. Richard's face turned pale as he nodded at Greg, signaling for the zookeeper to follow the employee. Without another word, the two of them rushed off, leaving Shaq and the crowd standing in stunned silence. Shaq didn't know if he could trust what was happening in the back, but something told him that the situation was far from over. The more he thought about the baby chimpanzee, alone and helpless in that cage, the more his resolve hardened. The sanctuary was falling apart, and no one was addressing the root of the issue. He could already see the cracks widening, the tension building up. If he didn't act now, it would all slip through his fingers. He turned back to the crowd, scanning their faces. Some were still looking at the chimpanzee. Some were on their phones, quietly snapping pictures, trying to ignore the discomfort in the air. But there were a few others, people who had noticed the same thing Shaq had. They were beginning to murmur among themselves, exchanging uncertain looks as if wondering whether they should do something, anything, to intervene. Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to explode. There were too many people involved, too many secrets that had been hidden for too long. The system that had allowed these creatures to be treated as spectacles, to be abused for public consumption, was now unraveling. But would it be enough? Was there time to fix this before it all came crashing down? The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Richard returned, walking quickly but trying to maintain his usual air of authority. His face was set in a grim expression. His eyes flicked to Shaq, and for a moment, there was a silent understanding between them. Richard was trying to keep control, but Shaq could see that the situation was beyond his grasp. "Everything's fine," Richard said, his voice forced, trying to regain the upper hand. "It's all being handled in the back. We've had a few issues with the other primates, but it's nothing serious. You can go ahead and enjoy the rest of your visit." The crowd was not convinced. Whispers spread like wildfire, and Shaq could feel the tension in the air thickening. The tourists weren't buying it anymore. They were beginning to see Richard for what he truly was, a man more interested in keeping his reputation intact than in the well-being of the animals he was supposed to protect. People were starting to ask questions. "What's really going on in the back?" someone asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. Another voice joined in. "Why don't you have enough staff to care for the animals properly?" Richard's smile faltered, and his eyes darted nervously from one person to the next. Shaq could sense that the pressure was mounting, that it was only a matter of time before someone would make a stand. He knew he had to make a choice. He couldn't stand by any longer and pretend like everything was fine. His platform, his influence, it could either be a force for change or just another blip in the headlines. The decision was his, but it was clear that the stakes were higher than he ever expected. Shaq took a step forward, his towering presence commanding the attention of the crowd. "Listen, I've seen enough," he said, his voice deep and firm, carrying the weight of the situation. "This place isn't right, and I'm not going to stand here and pretend like it is. Someone has to be accountable for the way these animals are treated." His eyes scanned the crowd, making sure every word landed. "We can't keep letting this happen." Richard took a quick step back, his composure cracking as the crowd turned their attention to him. For the first time, he seemed unsure of what to say. He could feel the walls closing in. "Shaquille," Richard started, his voice strained, trying to regain control. "This isn't the time or the place for this kind of accusation. You don't understand the complexities of running a sanctuary." But Shaq wasn't backing down. The crowd had begun to rally behind him, murmurs of agreement spreading. Shaq could feel the energy shift. Something had snapped. The tension that had been building was now at its breaking point. Shaq wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was the catalyst, the spark that would either ignite a movement or see the sanctuary implode. But as the atmosphere grew charged with anticipation, Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was still coming. Was this confrontation enough to change the sanctuary's course? Or was there more lurking beneath the surface, waiting to expose the truth once and for all? As the moment reached its peak, Shaq could sense that the real battle had only just begun. The air around Shaq was thick with tension, his words still hanging over the crowd like a challenge. People were watching, waiting for Richard's response, the pressure mounting as the reality of the situation sank in. Shaq's voice had cut through the noise, rallying the tourists and staff alike, but as Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, Shaq could feel something shifting. It wasn't just the sanctuary's future that was on the line anymore. It was something bigger, something far more dangerous. Just as Richard opened his mouth to try and smooth over the confrontation, a loud crash rang out from behind the sanctuary's main building. The sound reverberated through the crowd, startling everyone into a collective gasp. It was the unmistakable sound of metal clanging against stone, something heavy being thrown. People's heads snapped toward the noise, and Shaq's instincts kicked in. His heart raced as he realized that the chaos they had all been witnessing was only the beginning. Whatever had just happened back there was going to change everything. Before anyone could react, the employee who had first alerted Richard rushed forward again, her face pale and trembling. "The back gate, it's been breached," she said, her voice tight with panic. "One of the primates. One of the chimps has gotten loose." A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Shaq's mind spun as he tried to process the information. A chimpanzee on the loose? What did that mean? The sanctuary wasn't just facing accusations of mistreatment anymore. It was now a full-blown emergency. The sanctuary's carefully constructed image, already hanging by a thread, was about to come crashing down. Richard's face drained of color, and for the first time since he'd arrived he looked completely vulnerable. His facade shattered completely, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to be at a loss for words. This was no longer a public relations problem. It was a safety issue, a crisis that could destroy the sanctuary's reputation and its future. Shaq took a step forward, his eyes scanning the area around him. The crowd was beginning to panic, murmurs of fear spreading like wildfire. Some tourists were backing away from the enclosure, some were shouting questions, and others were pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding drama. But no one seemed to know what to do next. Shaq felt the pressure mounting, and despite the chaos, his mind was already spinning. "What's going on back there?" Shaq demanded, his voice calm but authoritative. He could see the fear in Richard's eyes. It was clear that the director had no intention of letting anyone in on the truth. But this was no longer just about the mistreatment of animals, it was about the safety of everyone involved, including the tourists. Richard wiped his forehead, trying to regain some semblance of control. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice low and almost frantic. "Just a mishap. We'll handle it." But Shaq wasn't convinced. Something in Richard's reaction didn't sit right. The director's usual charm had vanished, and in its place was panic. "What do you mean nothing? A chimpanzee can't just escape like that. How did this even happen?" Before Richard could respond, there was another loud bang, this time closer. The ground seemed to shake as something large, something powerful, crashed into the gate of the sanctuary's office, knocking it off its hinges. It was the unmistakable sound of an animal in full force, an uncontainable force that shook the very foundation of the place. Shaq's heart skipped a beat. The chimpanzee wasn't just out, it was angry, and it was heading straight for the heart of the sanctuary. The crowd froze. Some screamed, others ducked for cover. The chaos had escalated in an instant. But Shaq knew that the real danger wasn't the chimpanzee alone. It was the fact that no one seemed prepared for this. Richard's face twisted with panic as he turned to one of the employees, shouting orders in a rushed, clipped tone. "Call animal control," he said, his voice shaking. "Get the tranquilizers ready. This is going to get messy." But Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an accident. There was something behind it, something more deliberate. The way Richard was reacting, the way the staff had been moving around nervously before this happened, it all felt too coordinated, too perfect. Had this been planned? Was the escape staged? Or was it a result of the sanctuary's inability to manage their own animals? The reality hit him harder than he expected. The mistreatment of the animals wasn't just a few bad decisions. It was a systemic problem. The chimpanzee's escape wasn't a freak accident. It was a warning, a signal that everything was coming apart at the seams. As Shaq stood there, grappling with the unfolding chaos, he could hear the distant sounds of sirens in the background. Emergency response teams were on their way, but Shaq knew that by the time they arrived, things could already be out of control. The sanctuary was facing an imminent crisis, and Richard was clearly struggling to maintain any semblance of order. "Where's the baby chimpanzee?" Shaq asked, his voice cutting through the tension. His mind was racing. If the baby chimp was still in the same area, it could be in danger too. Richard's eyes flickered nervously, and Shaq's suspicion deepened. He had to know more. Was the baby chimpanzee even part of the escape, or was it being hidden away? Richard hesitated, his lips twitching. "I'll handle it," he muttered, his tone defensive. But Shaq wasn't going to let him off the hook. He turned toward the nearest employee, ignoring Richard. "Where is the baby chimpanzee?" he repeated, his voice firm, his body tense with urgency. The employee, clearly afraid, avoided eye contact, her eyes darting to Richard for guidance. But it was too late. The tension had reached a breaking point. Richard's attempts to control the situation had failed, and now the sanctuary was unraveling in front of everyone. As Shaq stood there, the sirens growing louder, a sudden realization hit him. This wasn't just about the mistreatment of the animals anymore. There was something far deeper going on, a hidden agenda, a cover-up of monumental proportions. The baby chimpanzee wasn't just a victim of exploitation. It was caught in the crossfire of a much darker truth. What had been an attempt to entertain the tourists had now escalated into something far more dangerous. And with the truth slipping further from his grasp, Shaq realized that the fight for the chimpanzees was only just beginning. As the sound of approaching sirens filled the air, he couldn't help but wonder, would anyone be able to stop the chaos from consuming them all? As the sirens grew louder, Shaq's mind raced. The world around him seemed to be collapsing in on itself. The sanctuary, once a place that seemed like it might be a peaceful haven for animals, was now a ticking time bomb. People were scattering, trying to find safety, and the air was thick with the kind of tension that only comes when things are on the edge of spiraling completely out of control. Shaq turned back to Richard, who was still floundering, his hands shaking as he barked orders to anyone who would listen. "Where is the baby chimpanzee?" Shaq demanded again, this time his voice more forceful, more urgent. Richard's face had lost all color, and his eyes flickered toward the back of the sanctuary, where chaos seemed to be unfolding. "We don't have time for this," Richard said, his voice cracking with stress. "We need to focus on getting the other chimps under control." But Shaq wasn't about to let Richard deflect anymore. The director was hiding something, and Shaq knew it. There was something bigger going on behind the scenes, and it had to be exposed. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me the truth about the baby chimpanzee," Shaq pressed. The tension between them was thick. Richard opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, the employee from earlier, the one who had been running back and forth between Richard and the rest of the staff, came forward. She was pale and shaking, her eyes wide with panic. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling, "there's something you need to see." Shaq didn't wait for Richard's approval. He followed the employee as she led him to a back door, away from the crowd and toward a small, restricted area of the sanctuary. As they walked through narrow hallways and past hidden rooms, Shaq's mind raced. What could they be hiding back here? Was the baby chimpanzee really in danger? Or was there something else at play? The door swung open, and what Shaq saw stopped him in his tracks. Inside a dimly lit room, there were cages, rows upon rows of them. But it wasn't the cages that caught Shaq's attention. It was the small, makeshift operating table at the far end of the room. On it lay the baby chimpanzee, its small body motionless, its eyes wide with fear. But this wasn't just a situation where the chimpanzee was being mistreated. It was something far darker. As Shaq stepped closer, he saw the signs of a troubling procedure. The baby chimpanzee had been sedated, but there were syringes and medical equipment scattered around. Someone had been performing unauthorized experiments on the creature. Shaq's blood ran cold. This wasn't just about bad care. It was about something much more sinister. Richard had followed Shaq into the room, and now he stood frozen in the doorway, his face drained of color. What is this?" Shaq whispered, his voice barely audible. Richard swallowed hard, his lips trembling. "It's not what you think," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We were trying to help the chimpanzees. The sanctuary is in trouble, Shaq. The donations have been drying up. I had to find a way to get the funding we needed to survive, to keep the sanctuary afloat. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Shaq's heart pounded as the truth finally started to piece itself together. The sanctuary, in its desperation, had resorted to illegal experimentation in an attempt to make the chimps more entertaining for donors. The baby chimpanzee had been subjected to chemical treatments, probably in an attempt to alter its behavior for the shows, to make it more docile or performable. But it had gone horribly wrong. And the escape? Shaq asked, his voice steady but full of fury. Was that stage 2? Was the whole thing a setup to distract us while you covered up your mess? Richard's eyes darted to the employee, who was standing by the door, looking at the floor in shame. I didn't plan for it to happen like this, Richard said, his voice faltering. I just thought I could control it. I didn't know things would spiral out of control. Shaq clenched his fists, his body vibrating with anger. This isn't about control, Richard. This is about the animals you've been exploiting for your own gain. This baby chimpanzee was never meant to be part of your plan. And now you've put everyone at risk. Before Richard could respond, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. The door burst open, and a group of animal control officers rushed into the room, led by a familiar face, the employee who had been trying to warn Richard all along. She had called for backup, and now the authorities were here taking charge. Shaq stepped aside as the officers moved past him, heading straight for the sedated chimpanzee. They didn't waste time. They knew exactly what they were dealing with. One of them approached Shaq, giving him a brief nod of acknowledgement. We've got this from here. We'll take the chimpanzee to a proper facility, and you don't have to worry about anything else. But Shaq couldn't shake the feeling that the truth hadn't been fully revealed. As the officers took over, Shaq turned back to Richard. You're not getting away with this, he said, his voice low and unyielding. I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly what you've been doing here. Richard's eyes narrowed. You can't do that, he said, his voice thick with panic. You don't understand. If the media gets hold of this, we're all finished. Shaq didn't flinch. He knew what had to be done. The only way you get out of this is if you take responsibility for what you've done, he said, stepping toward the door. But mark my words, Richard, this is just the beginning. You've been exploiting animals, and now the world will see it. As Shaq left the room and made his way back to the crowd, he couldn't help but feel a sense of resolution settling in. The sanctuary would be shut down, and those responsible would face the consequences. The truth had come to light, and the mistreatment of the animals would no longer be hidden in the shadows. But as Shaq glanced over his shoulder at the chaos unfolding inside, a final, chilling thought crossed his mind. Was Richard really the only one pulling the strings here? Or was there a deeper, darker force at play? One that would continue to haunt the sanctuary even after this day was over? The sirens grew distant as the officers secured the area, and the sanctuary, once a symbol of care for animals, now stood as a stark reminder of how greed and desperation could destroy even the most noble intentions. And as Shaq stepped out into the fading daylight, he realized that this was just the beginning of a much bigger fight for animal rights, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As Shaq walked away from the chaos, he couldn't shake the weight of what had just unfolded. The sirens were still wailing in the distance, but they weren't the loudest thing on his mind. What had started as a simple visit to a sanctuary had spiraled into something much bigger, a battle for the truth, the animals, and the integrity of the sanctuary itself. There was a sense of relief, of course. Richard would be held accountable for the illegal experimentation, and the baby chimpanzee was finally going to get the care it deserved. But something lingered in the air, a sense of unfinished business that Shaq couldn't quite shake off. He had done his part. He'd stepped in when it mattered, he'd exposed the truth, and now it was up to the authorities to finish what had been started. The sanctuary was being closed down, and the animals would be transferred to reputable facilities where they could recover, heal, and live their lives without the burden of exploitation. The fight, however, was far from over. Shaq knew that this was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The issue of animal rights, the systemic abuse of creatures for entertainment, was still a battle that needed to be fought every single day. As he got into his car, Shaq's phone buzzed. It was a text from one of his team members. The press is asking for your statement. Are you ready to speak out? Shaq hesitated for a moment. The situation was still fresh, and the media storm was bound to be intense. But then he remembered the faces of the tourists, the children, the employees who had seen firsthand the horrors hidden behind the sanctuary's walls. He knew that this was bigger than just him. It was bigger than the sanctuary or Richard or even the baby chimpanzee. This was about raising awareness, shining a light on the dark corners of the animal entertainment industry, and pushing for real change. He texted back, I'm ready. Let's make sure the truth gets out. Within hours, news outlets were all over the story. Shaq gave interviews, speaking candidly about what he had witnessed and what needed to change in the world of animal sanctuaries and entertainment. The media buzzed with the revelation of the abuse, the illegal experimentation, and the unspeakable treatment the animals had endured. But as much as the coverage focused on Richard and the sanctuary's downfall, Shaq knew that the real work had just begun. Animal rights activists rallied behind the cause, flooding social media with support and calls for stricter regulations. The story had ignited a fire, one that would continue to burn as long as the injustice remained. Shaq became an unexpected advocate for the cause, his platform giving him a voice that reached millions. People began to look at the way animals were treated in captivity, whether in sanctuaries, zoos, or circuses, and question whether their so-called care was really the best for them. The world, it seemed, was ready for a change. But despite the support and the growing momentum for animal rights, Shaq understood that this was only the first battle in a much longer war. The public's attention would eventually shift, and the fight would have to be kept alive. New legislation needed to be passed, stricter regulations needed to be enforced, and the practices of so many establishments that exploited animals for profit needed to be overhauled. The awareness was there, but awareness alone wasn't enough to drive lasting change. A few months later, Shaq visited a new sanctuary that was known for its ethical practices, a place that actually lived up to its promises of caring for animals. It was a stark contrast to the disaster he had witnessed before. The animals here roamed freely in spacious enclosures, cared for by people who were passionate about rehabilitation and sanctuary, not profit. Shaq couldn't help but smile when he saw a group of chimps playing in a large open area. Their eyes sparkled with joy. Their movements were fluid and natural, and for the first time since the whole ordeal began, Shaq felt a glimmer of hope. He spent time with the staff, speaking to them about their approach, and learning more about the challenges they faced in maintaining a facility that prioritized the well-being of its animals over entertainment or revenue. The sanctuary had seen its own fair share of struggles, especially in the wake of the controversy surrounding Richard's establishment, but it had managed to stay afloat thanks to passionate advocates and a community that believed in ethical treatment. Shaq spent the afternoon talking with the director of the sanctuary, a woman who had been in the business long enough to see both the good and the bad. "We have to keep fighting," she said, as they watched a group of chimps playfully chasing each other across the field. "The road is long, and there are still so many out there who don't get it. But every time we educate, every time we raise our voice, it makes a difference." Shaq nodded, deeply moved by her words. It was a reminder that change wasn't just about exposing one bad actor. It was about creating a culture where animals were truly respected and protected. As Shaq drove home that evening, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift just a little. He had seen the damage that abuse could cause, but he had also witnessed the power of truth, the strength of a united community, and the transformative impact of doing what's right. The journey was far from over, but he felt more resolved than ever to continue pushing for the change that animals so desperately needed. The truth had come out. Richard's sanctuary was closed, the animals were safe, and the public was more aware than ever of the cruelty that took place behind closed doors. But for Shaq, the journey wasn't just about this one victory. It was about a broader fight for the future, one where every animal had the right to live free from harm, free from exploitation, and free from the kind of suffering he had witnessed firsthand. It was a fight worth continuing, and as the sun set, casting a golden glow across the horizon, Shaq knew that the real change was just beginning. The world had seen the truth, and now it was up to everyone to make sure it was never hidden again.